It's time for another edition of the Improbability Engine. I'm Will Aubrey. My buddy Joe Darnell is here with me. And as always, we start with our moment of what? And so I'm going to start this week, Joe.
Okay.
A couple of days ago, I was looking at Facebook, as I am, 80% of the time.
Okay.
Anyway, I come across this posting by the Missouri Valley Conference, which I started following on Facebook back when Murray State was under consideration to join the Missouri Valley.
Right.
And it's a link to a teleconference that they had with their basketball coaches, a midsummer report for how things were going from each of the coaches. And I was like, wow, that's what a real basketball league does. I mean, it's an incredible idea. The OVC should do something like that. It keeps basketball at the front of people's minds during the off season. I thought it was terrific.
No, that's absolutely right. What a good idea. Just a clever, and it's not big. It doesn't have to be big splashy things. It's just handling your business as a league, and that's something that I know that there are many in the Ohio Valley Conference, namely Murray State fans, I think, that think that that's where the Ohio Valley Conference fails year in and year out, is in addressing the little things and keeping their perspective correct going forward. And I think that's right. My moment of what, speaking of conference realignment, the Horizon League has announced that they were going to start their realignment, and according to Tony Paul of the Detroit News, the Horizon had extended an invitation to one team to fill in for Valparaiso starting next season. And he had listed a bunch of teams that could possibly fit the bill as what they were looking for, from status to sports offered and so forth. And the one that jumped out at me was Southern Illinois University, Evansville. Now, or not Edwardsville, not Evansville, Edwardsville.
Okay.
So SIUE from the Ohio Valley Conference was mentioned in possible expansion rumors. And my first thought was, it's as asinine to replace Valparaiso and the Horizon with SIUE as it was to replace Creighton with Loyola Chicago. It just doesn't make sense. Now, luckily, some reports are coming out since that time that have said that that SIUE did not get an invitation. It's looking more like it's going to be Fort Wayne, the mastodons of Fort Wayne.
That's not good either, but...
It's not good either, but you know what? At this point, what are you going to do? So when I first saw it, my first thought was, what? And so it had to be my moment of what this week.
Okay, all right. I think you want to talk about scheduling.
I do, and this is something that every mid-major team that cares about college basketball deals with every year. It's an issue that happens to the best and the brightest of the Missouri Valley Conference, or maybe even the Atlantic 10 to some extent, although they're kind of on the cusp of not doing that. They're mostly private schools, or I think they're all private schools, and so they have a little bit more financial freedom to do that. But for teams like Murray State or, Northern Iowa or something like that, scheduling is the season that happens in the off season. It is as challenging as any other part of the season is being a coach. For Murray State, the talk of Missouri Valley Conference expansion has delayed their schedule, their ability to schedule some. I mean, they were looking at trying to have to fill slots that they currently had held with Missouri Valley Conference teams, and so they've delayed their schedule a little bit. But looking around to other mid-major teams, you can see that everybody is kind of trying to figure out scheduling on their own.
Well, the interesting thing about that is it's unclear to me and to a lot of people now, where your emphasis should be in scheduling. There, for a while, it seemed pretty clear.
Right.
You wanted to schedule in such a way as to maximize your RPI rating.
Right.
But the NCAA...
The Missouri Valley Conference back a few years ago was performing a master class in how to schedule to boost your RPI.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they got 4 teams in one year
Absolutely.
as a result of it into the NCAA tournament. And then the NCAA said, we can't have this.
The RPI is not any good at all. This thing doesn't work.
So although they still refer to the RPI, they only refer to it when it suits their purposes.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, they ignore it. And that's why Illinois State could have an RPI of 33, I believe, and not make it into the NCAA tournament this past year.
Right, exactly. And you look at what that's doing. So I'm going to read off a list of one-bid conferences last year.
Okay.
Okay? America East, Atlantic Sun, Big Sky, Big South, Big West, Colonial. Okay. So far, none of those are overly surprising. Conference USA, Horizon, Ivy, the MAAC, the MAC, the MEAC, and the Missouri Valley Conference. Okay, a couple of surprising ones in there. Conference USA and the Missouri Valley Conference, that's, we just mentioned Illinois State. They probably should have gotten in. The Conference USA was very down last year, and really, Middle Tennessee State was the best team, and they made it. So, I mean, you could kind of make an argument there. The Mountain West, the Northeast, OVC, Patriot, SoCon, Southland, SWAC, Summit, Sunbelt, and WAC were all one-bid conferences. Now, historically speaking, that's kind of surprising. I mean, you look at, to me, the ones that come to mind, the WAC. The WAC is no longer the conference it was 20 years ago. So we're not going to make those to be the comparison. This isn't the WAC of 1994. So that doesn't work. But the Sun Belt, Conference USA, Missouri Valley Conference, these are the Mountain West. These are fairly high-budget teams that aren't getting bids for their non-conference stuff. I mean, that's really what you're looking at here. And what's funny about it, the West Coast Conference had 2. The American Athletic Conference had 2. The A-10 had 3. Now, that's basically the cutoff line to any inclusion of mid-major schools. I mean, if you look at the West Coast Conference, you're going to say, okay, well, maybe St. Mary's is mid-major, but Gonzaga's probably not anymore. I mean, you can make that argument and say that, okay, they're in a mid-major conference.
It depends, obviously, on how you define mid-major.
Right. Back in the day, mid-majority had their red line, and the red line was the budgetary mark in which you separated mid-major programs from high-major programs.
And if you look at the work that Mark Adams has done on at-large bids to the NCAA tournament, to have any chance, you pretty much have to spend $3 million a year on your basketball program. And to have a good chance, you better spend at least $5 million a year on your program. And the money spent on basketball correlates much closer to who gets at-large bids than the RPI does.
Absolutely. And does so, and it plays out over time as well. This isn't something that's a one-year blip. Which these could be, these bids for last year could be a one-year blip. But what you see in that situation is this desire for college basketball fans to make the equivalency of, well, if you want to bid, you've got to have home games. That's true, but it's not the only part of that. And we've seen it since Mark Adams' work. And tip of the cap to Mark Adams. The man knows what he's talking about. He put forth a very detailed plan that is extremely broad. I mean, it covers a lot of different areas that all interplay in the same concept. But what it's being distilled down to is you got to have home games, which is not exactly what was being said. Let's look, for example, at America's sweetheart, Grand Canyon University. Their big rivalry is the University of Phoenix Online. Grand Canyon University, for-profit, out of Phoenix. They have a huge pile of money, and they want to be relevant in basketball. Right? They hire Thunder Dan Marley as their coach. They're recruiting some big-name guys. They're getting some guys transferring in, and everybody thinks they're going to be the next big thing. They released their schedule. Now, they play in the WAC, and we talked about the WAC is not the WAC from 1994. This is a completely different setup. So let's just assume right now that the WAC is going to be a mediocre league. They're not going to get a whole lot out of it.
Right.
So here is their schedule. They play their first 6 games at home. Now, if you're looking at the Mark Adams breakdown and you're saying to yourself, home games are the key, boy, that sounds great. 6 home games in a row? That sounds like something that the Big Ten does. It sounds like something Iowa does. Sounds like something, Kentucky does. 6 home games in a row. And then instead of a road game on the 7th, it's a neutral game that's right down the street in Phoenix. That's perfect. How good these guys are looking like they're pushing for an at-large. But let me tell you who they're playing. Florida A&M, Robert Morris, Little Rock, Norfolk State, San Diego, UC Riverside. Now, you could talk about San Diego possibly being an okay game in there. Robert Morris, depending on if they're up or down, could be a good game.
And maybe Riverside.
Maybe Riverside. And then the neutral game is St. John's.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean,
at least it's a Big East team.
Right, and it's probably winnable, which is what you want to have.
Right.
We'll get to that here in a second. The problem is, even if you win all those games, is there a good win in that group? One that you can hang your hat on come March and say, that's the win that should get me in to the NCAA tournament. I don't think so. I mean, they're not bad. If you win them all, they're all okay. So then the next group is 4 more home games. So you're saying out of the first 11 games, 10 of them are at home, right? This is fantastic. This is a team putting their money where their mouth is. They're going to make their priorities known. This is it. They play Grambling State, North Carolina Central, Mississippi Valley State, and Longwood.
Yeah, those games are really bad games.
Those are really bad games. So let's look at it. Lots of MEAC and SWAC schools. And let's be honest here, the MEAC and SWAC are not powerhouse conferences. In fact, if you look at it realistically, I don't see a win in there that elevates the program at all. You could win all those games, and the only narrative you've got is we haven't lost a game.
Yeah.
So then comes the last 3 out-of-conference games. Now, this is where it comes down to earth just a little bit. On the road at Louisville. Now, they could go into that game undefeated, and they'd still probably be a 40-point underdog at next year's Louisville team. I mean, in all honesty. Then they have Morgan State neutral in Las Vegas. Morgan State is one of the better programs out of the MEAC, but
it's the MEAC.
It's the MEAC. I mean, really, you're not telling anybody anything. And the last game, I would argue, is the best game on their schedule, and that's on the road at Illinois.
Okay.
Now, that's their entire out-of-conference schedule. Aside from Louisville, there's not a win that unto itself elevates the program.
Well, Illinois, you could argue.
You could argue, but Illinois is in rebuilding mode. They just fired their coach. They just hired Brad Underwood from Oklahoma State. I think they'll be good in a couple years, and they'll definitely raise the profile, but this is an Illinois team that was bad last year. So I would ask, and I guess the point of this whole thing is I would ask, would you be okay with your team having that schedule? And to me, I think I know what my preference is.
Well, Murray State plays year in and year out a tougher non-conference schedule than what that is.
Absolutely.
And this year's non-conference schedule will be tougher than that. So, I mean, so no, I would not be happy about that.
Okay, and so I guess the point I'm trying to make, and for people who are listening at home, if you're not a fan of Murray State, or if you've got your own team, you have to ask yourself, would you be okay with your team doing that? Now, there's a lot of home games. That's awesome. You know what I mean? As a Murray State fan, home games are tough. They're tough to get. They're tough to, you know what I mean? Nobody wants to come to Murray
Right.
whenever there's not a great chance of winning, usually.
Right.
And you can ask Illinois State last year. Illinois State was a great team. I mean, a really fantastic, talented team. They came to Murray State. Murray State was going to have its worst year in 30 years, and Murray State still beat Illinois State at home. I mean, that's what you get when you're playing tough teams.
See, the kind of schedule that I think excites fans is the kind of schedule that Murray State had when Tavester Anderson was the head coach.
I can appreciate that.
They would play one or two bye games, okay?
Right.
It was usually one, but sometimes I believe it was two. But then they would get games against high-profile mid-majors, or maybe even a high major in some cases, depending on how you define high major, coming to Murray State. I can recall back when Conference USA was a big deal, and back when Southern Mississippi had significant success, I can recall Southern Miss coming to Murray State. I can recall Detroit coming to Murray State for a real high-profile game. And, you know, those kinds of games excite fans, and road games against high major teams that you have a chance to win excite fans.
That, to me, is the key. So I'm looking at one of these years. This is 99-2000.
Okay.
And this is so there's the first game is versus Colorado Springs, which is non-D1.
Right. Okay.
Then there's a game in St. Louis against Rutgers,
Okay.
which Murray State won. A game versus Valparaiso that Murray State won. Again in St.
Right.
Louis, part of the Hoop and Quill Classic that year. And then a game against Southern Miss that they lost by 3.
Okay.
Those are
And back then, Southern Miss was a high major program.
right, and those 3 games, those are great games. I mean, those are the kind you want to have. You know what I mean? As a mid-major program, you want to have those kind of games because all those games are pretty good, even looking back on it. Then there was it was a lopsided schedule. There was an early season conference game that year, so we'll skip that one. Then it was Detroit Mercy in Murray. Good game. I mean, that's one you want to have. Western Kentucky and Bowling Green, a good game. Alabama State, which
You throw that in.
South Alabama.
And at that time, South Alabama was a solid program.
Exactly. That was a win, but that was down in Mobile. So you go and you steal a game on the road. Then they played Kent State, Rhode Island, and Purdue.
Good games.
Those are really, that to me is almost an ideal out-of-conference schedule. Now,
Absolutely.
if you were going to pick something apart, you'd say, well, I'd like to have a couple more home games. And yes, that's true, but you've got to look at it from the standpoint of, okay, how many of those were 1-1s? So that you have, a lopsided season the next season, maybe you have more home games the next season. And next season there was some...
And that Detroit Mercy game, fans were excited about that.
Oh, yeah.
That was a huge game. They were a high-powered mid-major at the time.
Absolutely.
And in terms of just the profile of both teams, it was like Murray State St. Mary was in 2012.
Right. And now it didn't get the media buzz.
Right,
But-
because we weren't undefeated.
Right, which happens. You know what I mean? That happens. But as a mid-major matchup for the year, that was a great matchup. I mean, 2 good teams. It's what you want to have happen. It's how you want things to work. All right, so let's look the year, let's say 97-98 for Murray State. And I use Murray State just because, frankly, I have the resources at my fingertips for that.
Right.
So it makes it easier to do. All right, at Dayton.
Great game.
home versus Belmont. Now, at this point, Belmont's not.
They're Division II.
They're Division II.
You throw games in like that.
You do throw games in
Even
like that.
teams like Louisville and Kentucky throw games
Absolutely.
in like that.
All right. So then the next game, also at home, Western Illinois. That's not bad. I mean, it's not a barn burner type that you've got to be there, but that's the kind of game you want to have on your That's the kind of the game that you want to get on your schedule,
right?
To fill, as opposed to a Division II school. Idaho State at Murray.
Good game.
Agreed. Then out of D1 again, Washington, Missouri. Not a great game. Campbellsville, not a great game.
Yeah, they had too many lower division teams on that schedule.
That's the problem. So as we look at these, we're being pretty harsh on these, saying, hey, look, this isn't good. But now this is where it gets interesting. They played a tournament in San Juan, the Puerto Rico Holiday Classic that year, and they played Michigan, Arkansas, and Iowa State.
Now, what has happened to Murray State over the last 7 or 8 years has been that they've had a hard time getting into those tournaments.
Absolutely, and you can see why here. A loss to Michigan, but a big win versus Arkansas, who was ranked at the time, and then they followed up with a win versus Iowa State. They went 2-1 in that tournament, and I'm here to tell you, the Puerto Rico Holiday Classic organizers didn't put on their tournament for Murray State to go 2-1. That's the problem that you'll find. You'll find teams that they'll put in there and say, oh, they're going to go in and be the sacrificial lamb. In Hawaii, it was always Chaminade of Hawaii. Mm-hmm. Because they're the host, it works out great.
Right.
In Anchorage, it's Alaska Anchorage. But it punishes teams. You punish teams who go in and win games. Because they don't want that. They don't want, if they're not bringing 8,000 fans down to San Juan for the game, why would they have them? You know what I mean? Why would you go through and do that? You've got a huge, Michigan, Arkansas, Iowa State. Those fan bases, they're just larger. They're larger fan bases than what Murray State is. I don't know how else to say it. And so that's what they want to do. They want those teams to get to those and win those tournaments because they want to go in and they want to win games. They want those people to show up and expect to win the tournament and say, yeah, we're Michigan. We beat Arkansas to win the Puerto Rico Holiday Classic. They don't do it to say, oh, we lost to Murray State. And so what you'll find is teams like Murray State, quality mid-major programs, there is an inverse curve here. There's a bell that drops in that says, all right, if you're not very good, you can get all those tournaments you want because you'll be the sacrificial lamb. If you're really, really good, if you're Dayton, if you're, Gonzaga or St. Mary's, if you're one of those teams that are elite level every year,
then you can get
those games. But if you're
in between,
you don't get those games.
Right.
And I think that's where Murray State is, and I think that there's a lot of mid-majors who are like that. I don't think that it's unique to Murray State at all. So when we talk about the schedule, Will, we've talked about some of these bigger schools and playing bye games and stuff like that, and it has a negative connotation. What do you look for in a bye game? What is your ideal bye game? If you've got to have one on the schedule, what is the ideal?
Well, in general, I think the ideal is to find a lower level team from one of the Power 5 leagues. Well, I say Power 5 leagues. Throw in the Big East.
I think that's probably
because
fair.
It's equivalent to those other leagues in terms of budget and
Absolutely.
profile. And they got like 7 or 8 teams in the NCAA tournament this past year.
Yeah, the Big East had 7.
Yeah, so obviously they fit the profile, but you don't want to play teams at the top of those leagues because it doesn't do you any good to go to Kentucky and lose by 50.
Right.
It just doesn't. Okay.
Or if you're Grand Canyon, it doesn't do you any good to go to Louisville
and
just get smacked.
Absolutely. So you don't want to play those kind of teams. But so that would mean if you're playing a team from the SEC, you look to play a Mississippi State.
Vanderbilt.
Somebody like that. Vanderbilt.
Absolutely.
Tennessee, somebody like that.
Yeah.
Okay? If you're looking to play somebody in the Big Ten, you don't want to play the teams at the top of that league.
Right.
Illinois would be a good pick, actually.
Right. And then that's one of the things we talked about. The best game on their schedule for Grand Canyon was at Illinois. Now, maybe not next year, not this season, but the season after. Brett Underwood's a good coach. That might be a top 10 or top team in the Big Ten. So you might look to go play Iowa, or you might go and play somebody else.
Northwestern. In most years, maybe not right now.
Maybe not right now. But you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I think there is scheduling is an art form, and it is difficult in the best of situations, and it's almost impossible in the worst of situations.
Now, I do think that if you can get it, you need to try to do 2-for-1s with some of these teams. And
Absolutely.
sometimes mid-majors like Murray State have been able to pull that off, where you say, okay, to DePaul, for example, we'll play 2 in Chicago if you'll come to Murray once.
Right.
And you can occasionally get teams like that to do it.
Absolutely, and that's where it gets creative. I know one of the better things that Dave Luce was able to do at Austin Peay prior to his retirement was a couple of years ago. He actually got a pseudo 2-for-1 with Tennessee, where he played 2 in Knoxville and they played 1 in Nashville at a neutral site. That was a coup for a team like Austin Peay, who knew they weren't going to get a home game. They knew it wasn't going to happen. But Dave Luce got to take his team to the Bridgestone, which is where the OVC tournament was that year, got to play a game and do some things, which is what you want to see. So I think looking at it, I think you're right. I think there are some teams that you'll take bye. You have to pick the teams very carefully, the ones you'll take buys from. I think there's a level just below those buy teams, budgetary-wise, that you can try to get 2-for-1s. Those are teams in the A10, just for argument's sake. Maybe you can get an A10 team to go 2-for-1. And it's not so much saying that A10 teams are that much ahead of anybody. It's just money-wise, they don't have to go on the road if they don't want to.
Right.
I mean, they can just go and they can buy some games and be okay. Then you've got your 1-and-1s. Now, for Murray State, not so much the rest of the Ohio Valley Conference, but for Murray State, those teams have been out of the Missouri Valley Conference. Teams like Evansville or SIU or Illinois State, Indiana State at a time was
Middle
in there.
Tennessee.
Middle Tennessee out of Conference USA. We talked about South Alabama. That's a Sun Belt team. So if you can maneuver it where you get 1-and-1s from Conference USA, the Sun Belt, and the Missouri Valley Conference, those are great games on your schedule. Now, you're not going to win all those games. You're just not. They're good teams. Even if you play the worst teams in the Missouri Valley Conference, that's still a pretty good team. Now, you'd expect to beat the worst teams in the Missouri Valley Conference if you're at Murray State. But playing Illinois State last year, that's a tough game.
As far as home games,
Yeah.
If you're a mid-major, you want other non-conference mid-majors to come and play at your place, you generally have to throw in a game against somebody like Campbellsville, a lower-level team. But I don't think you want more than one of those.
And honestly, it functions as an exhibition game. And as long as it's functioning as an exhibition game, that's fine. What we've seen far too often from other members of the Ohio Valley Conference is a desire to schedule Crawley's Ridge or some of these teams that are barely at the level they are, NAIA Division II or whatever it is.
As I vaguely recall, and I can't recall the name of the school, but as I vaguely recall, Martin has scheduled a team from it's the National Association of Christian Colleges.
Yeah.
That's really below NAIA level.
Yeah, and EKU has done the same thing with Cincinnati Christian and a couple other ones that are like that are NCCSA schools, which aren't even, they're not even NAIA.
Right.
Which to me that's kind of criminal.
It's like playing a high school team.
Right. It doesn't help you. Yes, you can sell some tickets to it, but the fans aren't excited about it. And frankly, it's not great. It looks good on highlight films, I guess, where you've got it. But if anybody looks into it, it doesn't look great. But you look at some of those schools, and we say NAIA. I think you should challenge yourself in NAIA as well. There are some decent teams in NAIA.
There are.
That's not to say that they should go and beat NCAA Division I teams year in and year out.
NAIA teams in the country
Right.
can play with a lot of NCAA tournament teams.
Absolutely.
They're probably not going to be able to beat any of the top ones. But there was a time when the NAIA at the very top was very, very good. I know one of the best teams the state of Kentucky's ever seen was a Kentucky State team from the early 70s.
Absolutely.
That had Travis the Machine Grant and Elmore Smith, two NBA players,
Right.
starting for them.
Right.
So, and there are still teams that pop up that are similar to that from time
Well,
to
and
time.
what you'll find is, generally speaking, the NAIA teams have, the best NAIA teams have utilized NCAA Division I transfers, guys who struggled either academically or got into trouble in a bigger school or a bigger college or a bigger whatever situation, and they go to these smaller schools, generally in smaller towns, to focus on basketball, to kind of reset. And they've utilized the NAIA with its ability to give you a 6th year if you took a red shirt at NCAA Division I. It gives these guys another opportunity. So you'll find some good basketball players on some of these NAIA teams.
Now, the reason that Kentucky State team was so good back then, and the reason NAIA schools were so good back in the 70s, was that the SEC and a lot of the other major leagues weren't taking black players yet.
Absolutely.
And as a result, those kids were going to historically black colleges and universities like
Right.
Kentucky State, which
Absolutely.
were NAIA schools.
Yeah, and they won a lot of games, and there were a lot of talented teams that came through those schools. So the big thing is, as you're looking forward to scheduling, it's not so much a question of just home games, because we can look back at Grand Canyon's schedule.
They need to be good home games.
They need to be good home games. And bye games aren't just, well, let's go play a top 5 team in the country. They need to be games that you can win, because that separates teams on the mid-major level from being good and great, is going to those places and winning games. The Memphis game in Murray State history comes to mind.
Now, Murray State has not released their schedule yet,
Right.
but through the grapevine,
Yeah.
I've heard that they are buying a couple of games this year.
Awesome. That's
So-
good news. Now, it comes back to what are you getting? Now, if you're buying those games in order to avoid playing NAIA or NCAA Division II or, God forbid, NCCSA teams, then that is fantastic news. If, however, it's a question of, well, we can afford to buy Alabama State, but we can't afford to buy South Alabama, that makes it more questionable, and you have to figure out what you want to do. But the idea of buying a home game is good. You want to have that, because that's showing that your athletic department is at least attempting to make that happen. But as we can see, you don't just buy any home game. You have to buy the right home game.
Right. Now, I think you wanted to give us a scouting report on Murray State's players so far during the offseason.
Absolutely, yeah. We went into this offseason kind of knowing that, okay, there are some players we know what we've got. And you got guys like Jonathan Stark. You got guys like Terrell Miller. You know, those are known quantity players. They're top of the conference. They're fantastic. But we had a lot of new guys come in. Who comes in? Who steps up? Who's ready? And honestly, 2 names have kind of percolated to the top. Just from what I've heard from people who've seen them play pickup games, or who have caught them, in the middle of something and kind of in passing, but noticed who they were. And the 2 names are Smith and Morant. Now, whenever we were looking at the recruiting class, those guys were on the opposite end of the hype train.
Right.
You know what I mean? Jay Morant was the guy that you said, this guy, John Morant's he's going to be the next guy. He's,
Right.
holy cow, where
The
did
next
this guy...
Joe Darnold.
Well, maybe the next Will Aubrey. But we don't want to give him too much pressure. So there's always concern when you've got a guy like Morant who comes in with so much hype that for some reason the pressure will get to be too much, and you'll expect too much out of a kid who's just playing his first year in Division One. But what I've heard kind of puts me at ease, because the phrase that I heard is Morant isn't fair. And that kind of makes you step back and go, what do you mean he isn't fair? And my understanding of it was, it's like if you played NBA Jam and you used the Michael Jordan cheat code. It's just not fair. It's not right. So Morant's coming in and he has already started playing at a level and understanding the speed and understanding the physicality of the D1. And to have a guy come in and do that early, that is fantastic news. And that's what you've got to have. You've got to have those guys that are going to come in and not feel overcome with pressure, but use that pressure to fuel them. And that looks like what Morant's doing. Now, Smith's on the other end of the spectrum. Smith was, when he committed, it was one of those you're like, I don't really know anything about this guy. And then doing searches, and he's got the same name as another guy who was a Smith who went to UNLV, and you look at it and you go, well, you watch his highlight video and you're like, well, yeah, it's good. It's good. I don't see any 360 tomahawk dunks. I don't see him,
Right.
elevating with his head over the rim, swatting a guy, or he's not 7 foot, or he's not 300 pounds of muscle. He's not Shaq. What is this guy? And so there was a lot of question going into it. And from what we heard from his previous coaches and from blurbs about him, they were all telling, hey, this is a guy you want to have on your team. This is a guy you want to have. And that sounds good. You always wonder if the proof is going to be there in the pudding when the time comes. And surprisingly, it's been even more glowing than that. From what I've heard, Smith's the kind of guy you've got to have on your team. He is a blue-collar, hard-working, he's that guy. The old adage is, if you want to get to Carnegie Hall, you got to have piano players, you got to have piano movers. And he is the ultimate piano mover, a guy who fights for every rebound, who is deceptively skilled with the ball, who can work on defense and doesn't ever quit. High motor, high energy, blue collar, grind it out kind of guy. And the most surprising part of it is he has an innate ability on the offensive end. He has an extremely quick release no matter what's going on. He's not going to dazzle you by flying through the air and dunking from the extended elbow. But what he will do is he will be quick to go up with the ball, which puts teams in a bad position. It makes them foul, makes them do things they probably wouldn't do normally. And frankly, that's what this team needed desperately last year, was a guy to come in and be that role player and just say, look, I'm going to absorb boards. I'm going to play defense. I'm going to do all these things that nobody really likes to do, but you've got to have it in order to be a good team. So his is a good story. A couple other things, Stark and Dupree, they're still what you got. Buchanan, physically gifted, big guy. Brown, the word I got from him, okay, so Tevin Brown, one of the higher rated recruits, a 3-star guy, looked to be an elite level scorer. The problem with those guys is sometimes that doesn't translate to the Division I level. I mean, just sometimes it doesn't. From what I heard, he is a machine from outside the arc, as in like 9 threes in a row. Just deadly from outside. Better dribbler than what we had thought, which is a great sign, because that means he's not going to get lost on the offensive end. He's not going to be a catch and shoot only kind of guy. But like every freshman, needs to develop on the defensive end. I mean, that's kind of an understood. Other guys that are starting to kind of work into those rotations, we got Taylor and Gilmore, the two Breons, Sancho and Lefty. Those guys are going to develop more as the time goes on and make those adjustments. Not everybody adjusts in the first week. I mean, it's not easy to do. So, as we get more information, I'll keep you guys updated on that one. But so far, so good. I'm pleased with what I'm hearing out of practice. Hawkins is a leader, from what I can tell, on and off the floor. And that's what you've got to have. And hopefully we'll see something better this year, and I'll have some updates for the next time.
That brings to a close this edition of the Improbability Engine.